what is the consensus in the anti-avoidance legislation between countries within the EU? For example, low-tax countries like Bulgaria. Very good question. So if you look at anti-avoidance legislation within the EU, this has become very increasingly harmonized, especially regarding concerns about tax base erosion and profit shifting and all the BEPS initiatives. Now, EU member states, including the lower taxed countries like Bulgaria, retain their sovereignty over their tax systems, but they must also comply with the overarching EU directives. And those directives are aimed at preventing tax avoidance, because you want to see it as one larger, let's say, structure of member states and not just the individual jurisdictions as they are. So the consensus within the EU regarding these anti-avoidance legislation can be summarized as follows. So you've got to adhere to the EU directives, and there's EU directives called the Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive, and then there's very specific country specific implementation. Now, if you look at ATAD, the Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive, that's a key part of EU legislation, and it includes provisions on interest limitation, exit taxation, General Anti-Abuse Rules, or GAAR as it is known, and then your typical CFC rules, Control Foreign Company rules. So it's very important that even the low tax jurisdictions also have to abide with these rules, even though the country-specific rules may say one thing, they've also got to, because they're part of the EU, they've got to follow a certain process and framework. So important to look at the country-specific implementation, which provides a framework, and any member state implements the rules within its national tax law, and it has got various or variations to accommodate the local circumstances. But these rules are influenced by its overall tax policy and rates. Bringing me to the next point, which is the GAAR, the General Anti-Avoidance Rule, and that is where most EU countries, including countries like Bulgaria, have adapted general anti-avoidance rules. And that allows tax authorities to counteract arrangements that, while they comply with the law, they lack economic substance and are motivated or primarily motivated by tax avoidance. Now, this situation does play out, and it can become very challenging within the EU states. And that's why 1 year again, because we're dealing with not the simplest of scenarios, we're dealing with some of the exceptions to the rule, one should involve good corporate or consulting advisors. Then, another point which I think is quite important is the harmonization versus the tax competition. And that exists also within the EU, European Union, as it exists in many other, let's say, larger jurisdictions or grouped jurisdictions like Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa. And so you'll also see in some of the oceanic countries and so forth. So if one looks at this, one would actually understand what is the tax competition within the EU, and how do low-tax countries like Bulgaria use their tax systems as a competitive advantage to attract investment. But they need to do it within the framework of the EU rules. So sometimes this could end up being an issue where the country doesn't necessarily, and I'm not saying Bulgaria is like that, they don't comply fully with the EU rules, but they comply sufficiently to remain within the EU. And then there's always exceptions which are entertained by the larger, let's say, entities or the jurisdictions, albeit that it's on the face value doesn't comply with what one would say is the spirit of the EU framework. Now, Bulgaria's position is it is a low tax country. It is historically attracted business with a favorable corporate tax rate of 10%, one of the lowest in the EU and one of the lowest in the world. And however, Bulgaria has implemented the required anti-avoidance measures in line with EU directives, including the ATAD. And this reflects a broader EU consensus that even countries with low tax rates must prevent aggressive tax avoidance strategies. So what this means then is you end up, in a situation where you've got cross-border cooperation between cross-border countries, and then you have the EU Court of Justice, which does come into a play where member states, including Bulgaria, must align their national practices with the EU Court of Justice. So in summary, while low-tax countries like Bulgaria benefit from competitive tax rates, they are bound by the EU's broader anti-avoidance framework.